I'm going to read out an article from Reuters posted earlier today, which I think is very interesting. And there's a few other things I want to add to this, so bear with me. I'm just going to read it out. It's not excessively long. So this is Reuters posted 5 hours ago. The headline is Germany says China sought to encourage positive COVID-19 comments. Doesn't say who the reporter is. Berlin. Chinese diplomats approached German government officials in an attempt to encourage them to make positive statements on how Beijing is handling the coronavirus pandemic, the German Interior Ministry said in a letter this month. The German government is aware of individual contacts made by Chinese diplomats with the aim of effecting positive public statements on the coronavirus management by the People's Republic of China, said the letter, seen by Reuters on Sunday. The federal government has not complied with these requests. The letter was dated April the 22nd and sent to Green Party Member of Parliament Marguerite Bowser in response to her question on whether Chinese diplomats had contacted German officials with the goal of encouraging them to make positive remarks. Comments by the Interior Ministry were first reported by the Welt am Sonntag newspaper, which cited the Chinese embassy in Berlin as rejecting the report as untrue and irresponsible. The embassy could not immediately be reached for comment on Sunday. China actively participates in international counter-epidemic cooperation efforts in line with its sense of responsibility towards its own people and global public health, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said on Monday in response to Reuters' request for comment. It is about justice and there's no need to seek praise, the ministry said. In the letter, the Interior Ministry said the government had acknowledged China's efforts to contain the pandemic, particularly since January the 23rd, even without being asked to do so by Beijing. It went on to say that Berlin had told the Chinese government that it believed transparency was important for combating the pandemic, without saying whether it believed the Chinese government had been transparent or not. The ministry did not give a time frame for the contacts. China shares information with the World Health Organization and other countries in a timely manner and in an open, transparent, and responsible way, sharing its experience in epidemic prevention and treatment with all parties without reservation, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said. On Friday, Reuters reported that China sought to block a EU report alleging that Beijing was spreading disinformation about the coronavirus outbreak, according to forward sources and diplomatic correspondence. The issue has also been a flashpoint between the United States and China, with officials on both sides trading allegations of hiding information. Reporting by Andreas Rinke, additional reporting by Beijing Newsroom, writing by Emma Thomason, editing by Francis Carey and Giles Elgood. Okay, so it's basically, who do you believe? My position is I do not believe the Chinese regime. I think they're professional liars. This is a regime that's lied to its own people for 71 years, so I really don't think anyone should give China the benefit of the doubt. Um, and I think the fact that they're denying it, the fact that they are trying to block the EU report, to me that just suggests, well, if they've nothing to hide, then why block it? You know, it's a principle that only the guilty want to hide information because if they're innocent and if all these measures that they're taking around the world are entirely for benevolent purposes of cooperation and diplomacy, um, then if that was their sole motivation, then why would they be so on edge about any sort of scrutiny? I think the answer is obvious, except for those naive people who still believe China, who still think that there's some sort of xenophobic plot going on here, led by the United States. There's other things going on, incidentally. Yesterday, I heard that Sweden has decided to abolish its Confucius Institutes from its universities. If you don't know, Confucius Institutes are supposedly just a cultural program in universities to promote Chinese culture, right? Sounds harmless on the surface, but there's long been speculation and concerns that these institutes are being used as a fifth column. They are funded by a body that is linked directly to the Chinese government, and one has to wonder what the real agenda is. I think they should certainly be scrutinised in this country as to, for example, the extent of debate that is allowed within these forums. So, if students are engaging in a Confucius Institute program, will they have free scope to debate, for example, to debate anything to do with what the Chinese government positions might be on so-called cultural issues? I think the cultural issues, the cultural program is kind of an excuse. Probably it does some of that, but I've long felt that they've been used as fifth columns. This is how Chinese so-called soft power operates. They're a lot less vocal in their strategy than Russia is. I mean, with Russia, RT is very obviously nationalistic, it's very obviously hostile to the West. Anyone with common sense can see what RT's agenda is. And our Russia, excuse me, doesn't have the same extent of infiltration because the Russian diaspora is a lot smaller than the Chinese diaspora. Now, to be clear here, before anyone jumps to conclusions, I'm not for a second saying that we treat every Chinese person with suspicion. And I do think it's important that we don't go down that line because that would be wrong. It would be bigoted. I mean, we know from history, for example, after Pearl Harbor, the internment of Japanese Americans, it was wrong. So there absolutely shouldn't be a kind of approach of collective punishment of all Chinese people and kind of targeting them because of their nationality. Nevertheless, I don't think it is unreasonable to consider that Beijing has been using very, very subtle techniques to undermine Western democracy. That includes looking up the diaspora. It's an uncomfortable fact, but there is substantial evidence for this. When we look at, for example, how mainland Chinese students have behaved in Western universities in recent years, getting involved in nationalist demonstrations, bullying fellow students from Hong Kong, threatening them. It's very hard to believe that the Chinese embassy has nothing to do with this. Embassies, I should say plural, because it goes on in more than one country. In another development, number 10 has now dropped China from its official comparison list. Apparently, they had a way of looking at different countries' coronavirus rates. They've now dropped China from that because its statistics simply aren't reliable. Wuhan city actually upgraded its death toll recently by a significant amount, I think by over 1,500. So the official death toll in China is now about 4,600 plus. Um, I don't believe that for a second. I do not believe that a country with 1.4 billion people would have more corona or less coronavirus deaths than a country with 10 million people, i.e., Belgium. Belgium's had 7,000 deaths. In fact, I think probably every country's underreporting, even the UK, because we're not including the deaths from care homes and at home. So if countries that have a free press that are far more open are likely downplaying the death tolls, then what do you think the situation is going to be like in a country like China, which has an iron grip on all media? And Chinese networks just told a state line. Um, I came across, well, rather, I was tagged earlier in a post by someone who I've had an ongoing debate with regarding China's role in all of this. The guy's very critical of Trump, British guy. We've had agreements on things, but I'm increasingly seeing what his narrative is, and he unfortunately is taking the position that this is Sinophobia to blame the Chinese government. He had a ridiculous video from Noam Chomsky talking about this being a new yellow peril. So, yellow peril refers to a policy in the late 19th century. It was particularly exemplified under the Chester Arthur administration, the Chinese Exclusion Act, where there was discrimination against Chinese immigrants coming to the New World. Irish, Germans, Italians were all accepted, but the Chinese were discriminated against. And without question, there was some real discrimination going on then. I mean, there were massacres in the West against Chinese miners, against Chinese railroad builders. Some awful things happened. But to compare the current situation to that, there has been, unfortunately, as we know, incidents of anti Chinese racism. But I think it's very dangerous to make those sort of comparisons because, firstly, there wasn't a pandemic going on with the Chinese Exclusion Act, it was just a nativist policy under the Arthur administration. What's going on now? We are in the middle of a global pandemic that began in China. which the Chinese regime covered up and which in all likelihood they continue to lie about. So this situation in Germany, Beijing can deny it, but I wouldn't put it past them for a second because their track record demonstrates the contrary. It demonstrates that they do go out of their way to try and promote pro-Beijing propaganda all over the world. And you might argue every country does this. Every country wants to protect its reputation. But the power that China has and the undermining efforts it makes within democracies really, really needs to be scrutinized. And if there's any iota of truth with this, and I think there is, the arrogance, the sheer arrogance for Beijing to be demanding that other countries thank them and praise them. It's not just Germany. This has been, in the case of Italy, there was reports that they were trying to seek favourable propaganda in return for the PPE they would send into Italy at the height of its coronavirus outbreak. So people really need to wake up and see what the Chinese regime is doing. I'm just blowing a candle out because, yeah, it was kind of one of those glittery candles and it was burning at the side. Anyway, I um I get really, really frustrated when people conflate criticism of the Chinese government with xenophobia. China is getting a lot of heat right now. There's no question about that. But the caveat is this, it's entirely deserved. I mean, what the hell did Beijing expect when they covered this up, when they punished the doctors initially? Um, Melissa Chen, the Singaporean journalist who I'm connected with online, she posted an article about Sweden getting rid of its Confucius Institute. And most people were of the same opinion or of the consensus that, yeah, this is a good move. But there were the predictable China apologists. Now, you usually see these people because they get into the game of whataboutery. So they'll point to all of Trump's problems, they'll point to how many problems America has. My take on that is it's legitimate to criticize the United States. I've been very critical of President Trump. No one can say that I haven't. I think it's legitimate to criticize things that are going on in the US. It is, after all, the world's most powerful country. It has to face scrutiny. And there are plenty of things to criticize about America, not least its lack of universal health care, which has been glaringly exposed during this. So there's a lot of reasons to criticize things going on in the US. Where I draw the line, though, is when people extend that, actually making out that the Chinese regime are the victims. I don't rank Noam Chomsky very high because he is of the worldview that everything is America's fault. I mean, Chomsky really has a very standard hard left worldview in this regard. He's a clever guy. I mean, he has legions of admirers, but he is on the wrong side of history. And for Chomsky to sort of say this is like yellow peril, even if you say that some of Trump's language has been irresponsible, speaking about Chinese virus, um, the problem with saying this is another yellow peril is the insinuation that there is no basis to it. I mean, with the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 19th century, that was just purely nativist policy. Stop Chinese migrants getting to the New World. It was racist. Let's face it. Um, with this, hard measures, assertive measures being taken against the Chinese regime is not anti-China, it's anti-CCP. Tom Tugendhat, who chairs the China Research Group, which is looking into all sorts of ways that we could be more assertive with China, has stressed they are not an anti-China lobby. But I don't think they should even have to say that. Because what does anti-China mean? Does it mean anti-Chinese people? Does it mean anti-Chinese culture? Does it mean anti-Chinese government? Frankly, anti-Chinese government is no bad thing. I understand politicians have to be careful with their words, and you probably couldn't have a situation where you completely cut off all relations to China. I accept that. But I do think we need to send out the message to Beijing that they can't demand respect without showing any. They cannot mislead the World Health Organization and their own people and then demand respect. And for them to deny the claims that are being made in Germany, well, look at what's happened domestically. Chinese social media is awash. I've seen it directly with posts praising the efforts of the government. It's entirely positive. There's absolutely no scrutiny whatsoever on Chinese media about the way that the government has handled the situation there. None. And those brave Chinese citizens who do speak out find themselves threatened or silenced or censored. So, to those useful idiots who continue defending China, who continue insisting that criticism of the Chinese government is Sinophobia, you could not be more wrong. And now is the time to talk about this, because if we don't, this will happen again. It has indeed happened before with SARS, although that was a much smaller scale. But the people who say that, who have this naive view, oh, let's just work with China, this is affecting everyone, let's just work together. It's all very noble and it's all very nice, but China simply cannot be trusted. I think we should work with them on some level, but we absolutely, I mean, if there's any sort of similar allegations here, we need to take that very seriously. I would say we need to summon the ambassador. Um, China thinks it can go around bullying other countries into conformity, and it has the gall. I find it utterly, utterly outrageous that the CCP has the sheer arrogance to play the victim and to suggest that they're not trying to seek praise. Of course they are. Of course they are. They're trying to. I mean, you would expect that from any government. Every government defends itself. But with China, it's uniquely problematic because this pandemic began there. If this happened in another country and that country was behaving the way the Chinese government was, I'd be just as critical of that country. But it happened in China. It began in China. And we've seen what the lack of transparency does. So I'm encouraged by these signs of it's gradual. I'd like to see a lot more happen. But really, things have to change. When this pandemic finally phases out, in whatever way that might be, we really, really, really must reassess our relationship with China. This China research group, like I say, headed by Tom Tugendhat, MP, is based apparently on the European Research Group, which was the Eurosceptic group that pushed the May government on Brexit. So it's based on the same sort of model. I think that we do need to distance ourselves from Beijing after this, not completely cut off, but the illusion, the facade, the ridiculous facade under the Cameron Osborne years of the so-called Sino Golden Era, it was a facade. I never believed it was true. I never believed that there was any sort of optimism from that because it became fairly obvious early on that Xi Jinping was no reformer. I would say about 6 months into his assuming power, it became obvious that he was not a reformer. Um, and the bottom line is this: China cannot be trusted. It's not xenophobic, it's just the reality. I mean, why do we not use, why do these people who say it's racist not hold the same, why do they not say it's racist to be assertive about Russia? Russia can't be trusted. We've taken a hard line with Russia in recent years. I still think we could do more. I'd like to see RT get its license stripped. But when May expelled Russian diplomats after Salisbury, there weren't many people saying it was racist to be anti-Russian. Why? Because the Russians are mostly white. I don't know. But conflating scrutiny of and a hard line on China with anti-Chinese racism is a very, very dangerous game because all that does is play into Beijing's hands. It's totally compatible to condemn that racism, and I'm not saying it isn't there. It is, unfortunately. Condemn it, whilst also being very assertive about the agenda of the Chinese government. I mean, they have no right whatsoever to be boasting over this. And you just have to look at what's going on in their domestic media. I've seen it directly, and it makes my stomach turn, the amount of dishonesty that is there. And it's more than that. It isn't just that they're praising themselves, they're actively pushing jingoistic conspiracy theories about the West, especially America, but the West in general. You know, they'll blame Western media, they'll blame the US Army. Um, so for anyone to claim that China is the victim, you know, they really need to look at China's jingoism, sheer arrogance of it. And regarding racism, there was there is mounting concerns about the racism in China. I mean, Nigerian workers in Guangzhou, mostly they've had good relations, but cracks are starting to show. And there is a racist undercurrent to Chinese society, particularly towards black people. Um, I was speaking to a Nigerian contact recently, and he was praising the Gambian government for expelling Chinese diplomats because of the way Gambians were being treated in China. Apparently, people will openly hold their nose as they walk past black people. Now, this is not to generalize. That's not to say every Chinese person is racist. Of course, they're not. I know they're not. But it is a problem. So, for China to play the victim, and by China, I mean, actually, I do mean both the government and society. It's a bit galling, quite frankly.